Thank you for joining me on this week's Top Minds in the Business, part of Intercom's Oil and Gas 360's website series. I'm joined today by Dr. Sarah Vakhshouri, president of SVB Energy International, a global strategic energy consulting firm that specializes in the oil and gas industry. Dr. Vakhshouri has a PhD in energy security in the Middle East and has written articles for prominent journals, including the Economist, Middle East Economic Survey, and the Oil and Gas Journal. She's also authored her own book titled The Marketing and Sale of Iranian Export Crude Oil Since the Islamic Revolution, and has been a frequent guest on Platts Energy News as well as BBC's News. Thank you very much for joining me today, Dr. Vakhshouri. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, our first question for you today it involves Iran. They've said that they can withstand $25 a barrel oil. Do you see that as posturing, or is the Iranian oil industry stronger than we thought?
No, actually, I more than see that as a political message. I see that as an economic message. I think that Iranian officials came up with two numbers, and that shows their tolerance. Iran's Ministry of Economy said that they are going to revise the budgetary plan, and they're going to set their budget on the oil of $40 per barrel. And Iranian oil minister mentioned that Iranian oil industry still could function with the oil of $25 per barrel. So I see a confidence in the both messages. If the Iranian Minister of Economy is saying that their budget is going to be on the oil of $40, then he has the confidence that their economy is not going to collapse with the budget set on the oil of $40 per barrel. And with regard to Iranian oil industry, they have already done some investment and work, and they are looking forward for some of the phases in South Pars and one of the big refineries called Persian Gulf Star to to reach to their final structural phases and start to run their production. So I think for particularly this year, 2015, it's going to be a hard year for most of the oil-dependent economies. These two numbers could be the bottom lines of their potentials and sensitivity. It shows, of course, their sensitivities. It could say that it shows or determine that what is Iran's bottom line, that oil of $25. But I could see that they could still maintain their economy and oil industry function with those numbers.
Okay. And with the low oil prices that we're seeing, do you expect to see any changes in the domestic, foreign, or energy policies in Iran?
Well, the major change that happened is in their budgetary plan. If you look at that for this year, the share of the oil prices and oil revenue in Iran's budgetary plan reduced significantly to around 35%. And this is a big reduction from nearly 85% before the sanctions in 2012, and then 60% in couple of years ago. So in the long term, that could be, in theory, good for Iran's economy, that the share of the oil revenue is reduced severely. But on the other hand, to generate income, the government is planning to increase the income tax and customs tax. Also, they are planning to have some savings from reducing to further reduction of subsidies on the fuel prices, which is actually part of the subsidy reduction plan. The third phase is going to be implemented this year.
Okay. And more on the topic of OPEC, is OPEC still the world's dominant price-setting force in the petroleum industry? And how do you see the organization's role changing in the next 5 years?
Well, just look at it. All these sharp price drops started by Saudi's decision, and then the OPEC final decision that they are not going to reduce their oil production. So still, OPEC has a high influence and an influential role in the oil market and the pricing system. But there are, of course, other influential factors. For instance, other major non-OPEC producers like U.S. and Russia. We have huge oil production growth from unconventional resources in North America that should not be ignored. Also, we have the paper market. The amount of trades that's happening in a paper market, the oil stock market, is about 7 to 10 times more than the physical market. So we should not ignore the importance and the high influence of the prices determined and the contracts, future and option contracts for oil deliveries in the paper market, particularly when we are talking about the psychological effect in the market that exaggerates in the oil paper market. For instance, if there's going to be any fear of a major price drop in the market because of any political turmoil, or on the other side, if, for instance, the Saudi king announces that they're not going to reduce their oil prices, this psychological effect on the oil price market exaggerates in the oil price in the oil stock market and paper market, and that has also a major influence on the physical prices.
Okay, and talking about the Saudis, what kinds of changes do you predict to take place with the death of King Abdullah?
Well, I mean, things exactly went according to what we advised to our client and what we were expecting. We didn't expect any major change in the oil prices. We were expecting a very minor price increase, and that's just because the market is witnessing a power change in a major producing oil country, a country that is supporting the price drop by not reducing their oil production. We are not expecting any major change because, first of all, in Saudi leadership, among the Saudi leaders, there is a council, or what they call a shura, which all the major decisions are decided in the council. So if, particularly at that time that the king was very old. So we didn't expect that this decision is going to be changed from a power transition from one king to the other king. And the current king, King Salman, was, of course, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia at the time that this decision was made. Also looking at the influential people in the oil industry in Saudi Arabia, the son of the current king, the son of King Salman, has a high influence in the oil industry in Saudi Arabia. He's deputy of oil minister. So we didn't really expect any major changes in the oil policy, and especially such a policy that Saudi Arabia taken has a high. They have high goals. They set high goals to achieve with their current oil policy, both in the for their energy policy and foreign policy. So we are not expecting really to see any major price change with the current power transition in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, and you talked about the Saudis having high goals with their energy policy. As I understand it, they also use income from oil to subsidize a large part of social programs inside the country. Do you expect that these low oil prices are going to start to put pressure on that?
Well, your point is correct. Of course, in the past years, in the recent years, Saudi's expenditure on the public expenditures has been increased. But on the other hand, their foreign reserves fund have been increased much more than their public expenditure. Saudi Arabia currently has nearly $700 billion of foreign reserves assets in their funds. So they have money enough to borrowing from themselves for their public and other domestic expenses for many more years to come.
Okay, so it sounds like the Saudis will be able to weather this price drop fairly well. What about other OPEC countries? Are they going to be as well positioned for it?
Well, of course, the oil price drop is going to have a negative impact on the economy of all of the OPEC producers, including Saudi Arabia, because most of these countries' economy is highly dependent on the oil prices and oil revenues. We're expecting that among the Arab producers of OPEC, there might be some health and financial aid by the other economies like Saudi Arabia, that they have higher cash reserves to those countries that they are more in need of. We're expecting that Saudi is going to lend money to some of the other Arab OPEC producing members, but some of countries like Iran or Venezuela, of course, they're going to face harder pressure, particularly in the case of Iran, because Iran's oil is already under limitations because of the international EU and American sanctions on the oil export. So they are not able to increase their export in order to reduce their budgetary gap.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. One final question for you. Could you give us some insight on how Israel factors into the energy policy of other Middle Eastern countries?
Well, just looking at the market, of course, I don't see Israel a major player in the supply, demand, and market fundamentals. They might have some political influences, of course. They might have some political interest in the prices dropping or rising, of course, more in price drops, because it's going to have further pressures on economy of their major rivals like Iran. But I don't see them as a major players in the oil market, and I don't see them having a high influence on the current price drops in the market.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for joining us today, Dr. Vakhshouri. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.